By Friday, the silver-gray mare would be sold for slaughter. She had thrown 2 men, bitten a third, and refused every buyer who entered her pen with a rope. Before sunrise, Marcus Whitlock led her behind Doyle Feed and placed a folded bill of sale on Rebecca Doyle's ledger. Rebecca's name was written across the bottom. Why? Because every horse in Millbrook is too small for you. Her face hardened. Marcus held her gaze, and because this one refused to be made smaller for anybody. 3 months earlier, in Millbrook, Texas, Rebecca had never heard Marcus Whitlock's name. Millbrook had already decided what kind of woman Rebecca Doyle was. Too tall for delicate dresses, too direct for polite company, too capable for men who preferred being needed. Her mother, Anne, had been soft-spoken and graceful. Rebecca adored her, but never resembled her. When Anne died, Rebecca was 19. Within a month, she was running the accounts and deliveries at Doyle Feed. Everett Pike, the merchant across the street, told her father that wholesale business required a man's judgment. When he raised his prices, Rebecca rode 40 miles to another supplier. When he claimed she could not handle large orders, she delivered 12 wagon loads during a storm. By 25, Rebecca had saved the business and owned half of it. Customers still looked past her for a man they could call the real owner. One October morning, Rebecca crossed the store carrying 2 sacks of oats, one against each shoulder. A stranger stepped aside. Most men would have rushed to help. Some would have insisted, not because she needed them, but because they needed the performance. The stranger only cleared her path. Rebecca set the sacks down. You need something. 40 pounds of stock salt, 2 coils of wire, liniment if you have the good kind. We have one kind. Is it good? Yes. Then that one. She studied him. You're not going to tell me those sacks are too heavy? They're already where you wanted them. Rebecca almost smiled. The stranger noticed. His name was Marcus Whitlock. He was 37, broad through the shoulders, sun-browned, and newly hired as foreman at Barrow Ranch. He returned 2 days later for nails he did not need, then for lamp oil the ranch bought by the crate, then for a curry comb despite owning 3. By the 4th visit, Rebecca folded her arms. What are you actually here for? Marcus looked around the store. Today? Yes. Coffee. We don't sell coffee. I know. Her father coughed from the back office. There is a pot on the stove, he called, and I am going to lie down. Marcus removed his hat. Rebecca poured coffee. After closing, they sat on the loading platform while the road faded into blue shadow. Why do you keep moving? She asked. Habit. That is not an answer. Marcus watched the empty road. If I stay, people learn where to hurt me. And leaving means I can tell myself I chose it before they did. He had once owned a small ranch in Kansas with his younger brother. A grass fire destroyed most of it. His brother borrowed money to rebuild, disappeared with the loan, and left Marcus responsible for the debt. Marcus spent 6 years repaying money he had never used. After that, he stopped building anything he could not carry in a saddlebag. You are tired, Rebecca said. Yes. Of work? Of not belonging anywhere long enough for leaving to matter. Rebecca looked toward the store her mother had helped build and her father had nearly lost. Leaving always matters to someone. Marcus turned toward her. Neither spoke for a while. That was where it began. The following week, Rebecca delivered feed to Barrow Ranch and found Marcus standing inside a sale pen with a silver-gray mare. The mare had a pale scar at the corner of her mouth, and fear buried beneath every movement. She backed away from anyone who approached too quickly. Mr. Barrow leaned on the fence. She has thrown 2 men and bitten another. Dealer comes Friday. After that, she is not my problem. Marcus entered without a rope. He stood near the gate and waited. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. He did not reach for the mare. He did not corner her. He shifted only when she shifted. At last, she stepped close enough to smell his sleeve. You wasted 20 minutes, Barrow called. Marcus kept his eyes on the animal. She spent 2 years learning that men enter a pen to force something. 20 minutes is cheap. Rebecca remembered the sentence. The mare allowed Marcus to touch her neck, then backed away. Are you buying her? Rebecca asked later. Not yet. Why not? Because I do not know whether I can help her. It was the first time Rebecca heard a man admit uncertainty without turning it into shame. Give me a month, Marcus told Barrow. He did not yet know what the mare would become. He only knew stubbornness was not the same thing as worthlessness. Marcus kept visiting Doyle feed when the store was quiet. Sometimes they spoke for 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. He asked why Rebecca stayed in Millbrook. "My father needed me." "That is why you did not leave. It is not the same as why you stayed. You ask too many questions." "I have been told." Rebecca set down her cup. "I stayed because this store matters. Ranchers can lose a season over one late delivery or one dishonest price. My father built something useful, and because you are good at it." Rebecca hesitated. People praised her work when they wanted something. Marcus said it as if competence itself deserved recognition. "Yes," she said, "because I am good at it." Outside the store, Millbrook remained less generous. At church socials, women suggested softer colors. Men joked that Rebecca would have to marry someone shorter and spend the ceremony looking over his head. Everett Pike preferred sharper weapons. He leaned against Rebecca's counter one afternoon and offered to buy Doyle feed for barely more than the building was worth. "You have done well for a woman alone," he said. Rebecca continued writing in the ledger. "You have done poorly for a man with every advantage." Pike's smile tightened. "Railroad men prefer dealing with someone who understands scale. I delivered 12 wagon loads during the March storm while your driver stayed in town. That contract can be reviewed. So can your invoices." Marcus entered carrying salt blocks. Pike looked toward him, expecting support. "You let her speak to men that way?" Marcus set the blocks by the wall. "I have not found a way to stop her. I have not looked for one either." Rebecca almost smiled. Pike left with his offer unsigned. By the next morning, the rumors had begun. Marcus wanted the store. Marcus wanted her father's accounts. Marcus planned to marry Rebecca, sell the business, and disappear. Rebecca dismissed the talk as Pike's usual poison. Still, she noticed how easily Marcus spoke with her father about freight routes and storage. She noticed how closely he studied the ledgers when a supplier changed terms. The attention should have felt like respect. Because of Pike, part of it began to feel like danger. Marcus sensed the distance but did not force an explanation. He kept ordering what Barrow Ranch needed, paying the price Rebecca named, and asking where she wanted each delivery placed. Then a rail delay caused a grain shortage across 3 counties. Pike bought every shipment arriving in Millbrook and doubled the price. Ranchers crowded Doyle feed asking for feed Rebecca did not have. Across the street, Pike sold grain at rates that would force smaller farms into debt. Rebecca checked the rail schedule. The next shipment would not arrive for 9 days. Marcus found her in the warehouse studying empty bins. "How many families are short?" 17. "How long can their stock last?" "Some, 3 days." He looked at the map on the wall. "What about San Angelo?" "Too far by wagon." "Not by relay." They spent the night organizing teams. Marcus rode ahead to secure grain from an independent supplier. Rebecca gathered 6 wagons and convinced ranchers to provide fresh horses along the route. The trip took 4 days instead of 8. On the second night, a wagon wheel split 12 miles outside San Angelo. Rebecca unloaded half the grain by a lantern light while Marcus cut a replacement brace from mesquite. Neither suggested turning back. At each relay station, exhausted ranchers arrived with fresh teams and quiet hope. By the final morning, every driver was riding on coffee, dust, and the knowledge that 17 families were waiting. They returned beneath a hard Texas sun with enough grain to keep every small ranch operating. Rebecca sold it at the ordinary price. Pike stood beneath his awning and watched customers cross the street away from him. That was the moment his dislike became hatred. That night, ranch families held an impromptu supper behind Doyle feed. Children climbed the wagons, women brought pies. Men who had nearly lost their herds shook Rebecca's hand. Marcus remained at the edge of the lantern light. Rebecca joined him. "You did not stay for the praise." "I did not do it for praise." "Why did you do it?" He looked at her. "You know why." She did. She was not yet brave enough to answer. Marcus continued working the gray mare before sunrise. He named her Silver. One morning, Rebecca watched from a ridge as Silver refused to cross a wooden bridge beside the lower pasture. Marcus never struck her or tied her head short. He walked across first, returned, and waited until she lowered her nose to the boards. When Silver finally followed, Marcus did not celebrate. He only rubbed her neck and let her breathe. Over the next weeks, Silver learned to accept a blanket, then a saddle, then the weight of Marcus leaning across her back. He never pushed 2 lessons into one morning. When she trembled, he stepped away before fear became a fight. Rebecca began bringing the ranch orders herself. She told herself the route was efficient. Her father never challenged the lie. Later, Rebecca stood beside the mare. "Too large for most buyers," Marcus said. Rebecca ran a hand along Silver's shoulder. "People say that as though size were a character defect." Silver breathed against her sleeve. That evening, Marcus found Rebecca stacking sacks after closing. "Need help?" "No." He stopped. That sounded different. "I am tired. I can see that." She lifted another sack. Marcus reached for it, then stopped before touching it. Rebecca noticed. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing." That is rarely true when someone says it that way. She turned toward him. "Why do you keep asking about the store?" "Because it matters to you." "Do you want it?" He frowned. "The store, the accounts, a partnership." "No." "Then what do you want?" "You." The word landed between them. Rebecca went still. Marcus stepped closer but did not touch her. "I ask about suppliers because you talk about them. I ask about storage because the north wall leaks and you pretend it does not. I learned the business because it is part of your life. No man comes here this often for coffee. I know. No man in Millbrook has ever looked at me the way you do." That sounds like Millbrook's failure. Her anger broke around something older. "They have called me too loud since I was 12, too strong since I was 15, too independent since my mother died. Every year, there was some new way I was wrong." Her voice lowered. "I learned to act as though it never touched me." "But it did." "Yes." Marcus took one careful step forward. "Rebecca, there is nothing about you I want made smaller. Not your height, not your voice, not the way you enter a room already knowing what needs to be done." He lifted a hand but stopped before touching her face. "You are not too much." The door opened. Everett Pike entered carrying a packet of papers. "I hope I am not interrupting business." He placed the packet on the counter. The railroad purchasing office had suspended Doyle Feed's contract. 4 invoices appeared to show Rebecca charging different prices to different ranchers. Attached was a letter accusing her of manipulating accounts. Marcus's name was signed at the bottom. Rebecca looked at him. "I did not write that," he said. "It looks like your signature." "It is not." Pike's smile was almost invisible. "Perhaps the railroad office will decide." Marcus crossed the room. "Careful. Threatening a merchant. Warning a liar." Pike left. Rebecca wanted to believe Marcus. She also knew the railroad contract kept Doyle Feed alive through winter. "I need you to leave," she said. Marcus stared at her. "Rebecca, please." At the door, he stopped. "I have never lied to you." Then he left. The days that followed were worse than Rebecca admitted. She told herself anger improved concentration. Instead, she entered the same figures twice and shipped the wrong grain to the Carter place. Her father found her in the office after midnight. "You have not eaten." "I am not hungry." He sat across from her. "Your mother used to do that." "Do what?" "Turn pain into work and hope no one noticed the difference." Rebecca closed the ledger. Did anyone ever tell her she was too much? Her own mother told her she laughed too loudly. Rebecca looked surprised. "She barely spoke above a whisper. By the time you knew her." Her father rested one hand on the desk. People can train a person out of herself one correction at a time. Rebecca looked down. "I thought being strong meant it did not matter. Strength means it mattered, and you stayed standing. It does not mean you must stand alone." The railroad hearing took place 2 days later. Rebecca arrived with her original ledgers, delivery receipts, and every driver who had handled the disputed shipments. She showed that the forged invoices used paper not sold in Millbrook until 6 months after their printed dates. Each document repeated the same misspelling in the name of a ranch. The purchasing officer restored Doyle Feed's contract. Outside the office, Pike waited beneath the shade of the boardwalk as though he had merely come to observe. Rebecca walked past him carrying the ledgers against her chest. "You were fortunate," he said. "No," she answered. "I kept records." For the first time, his smile disappeared completely. Rebecca had won the business fight herself. But the forged letter still carried Marcus's name, and Pike still walked free. Marcus had gone to Fort Worth. He returned 10 days after leaving, accompanied by the clerk who had prepared the false papers. The clerk carried a payment record bearing Everett Pike's signature and a statement witnessed by a notary. Marcus went first to Rebecca. "I should have told you where I was going," he said. "I was angry and decided proof mattered more than trust." "It did not," Rebecca answered. "No." They took the clerk and the documents to the sheriff together. Pike denied everything until the clerk identified him and produced the payment record. The sheriff arrested Pike for forgery and fraud, while half of Millbrook watched from the boardwalk. Pike tried one final insult as the cuffs closed. "No man will stay beside a woman who must win every fight." Marcus looked at Rebecca, not Pike. "She did not need me to win this one." Rebecca handed the evidence to the sheriff. "But he was wise enough to bring the truth to the person you tried to ruin." The crowd received no speech. It received an arrest, a forged signature, and Rebecca standing in front of the business she owned. After Pike's arrest, Marcus did not assume forgiveness. For 2 weeks, he returned only when Barrow Ranch needed supplies. He ordered at the counter, paid, and left. Rebecca hated the distance. She also respected it. One evening, she rode to the ranch and found him repairing a saddle outside the bunkhouse. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You were shown convincing evidence." "I was shown what I was already afraid to believe." Marcus waited. "I thought if you wanted the store, at least that would explain why you wanted me." His expression changed. "That is an ugly thing to say." "It is an honest one." He stepped closer. "Rebecca, I noticed the store because it is where you are. I learned the business because it matters to you. If Doyle feed burned tomorrow and you walked out with nothing but the clothes you were wearing, I would still follow you down the road." Her eyes filled. "That sounds foolish." "It probably is." "I do not need foolish." "No. What do you need?" Marcus smiled slightly. "A reason to stay." Rebecca took his hand. "Then stay." Marcus did not kiss her immediately. He waited until she stepped closer. That small restraint told Rebecca more than any promise could have. In the weeks that followed, he returned to Doyle Feed without pretending nothing had happened. Trust came back in ordinary pieces: shared coffee, repaired hinges, an honest answer given before it was demanded. Weeks later, a thunderstorm rolled over Barrow Ranch. Lightning struck near the barn. Silver broke a gate latch and ran toward the road with a length of chain dragging behind her. Marcus followed on foot. Rebecca cut across the pasture and reached the mare first. Silver's eyes were white. Grabbing the chain would have sent her through the fence. Rebecca stood in the rain and lowered her hands. "Easy," she said. "Nobody here is going to make you smaller." The words were meant for the horse. Marcus heard them anyway. Silver stopped running. Marcus approached from the side and freed the chain. Together, they walked her back through the storm. Inside the barn, Rebecca noticed a new saddle blanket, widened stirrup leathers, and a mounting block built higher than usual. "You are training her for someone." Marcus wiped rain from his face. "I am trying to." "Who?" He looked at Silver instead of answering. Rebecca understood enough to feel frightened by hope. Before sunrise on a cold December morning, Marcus led Silver to the loading platform behind Doyle Feed. Now Rebecca stood with the bill of sale in her hands and the mare waiting beside him. Marcus had already told her why. Rebecca walked into the yard. Silver lowered her head and waited. "You are certain?" Rebecca asked. "No," Marcus said, "but I trust both of you more than I trust certainty." Rebecca mounted without help. From the saddle, she sat tall enough that no one could mistake accommodation for excess. Marcus looked up. "Exactly right." For once, the gift did not correct her. It matched her. Rebecca leaned down and kissed him. 6 weeks later, Marcus asked her to meet him on the same loading platform at sunrise. One cup of coffee waited beside him. Another waited for her. "You have learned," Rebecca said, slowly. For a while they watched Millbrook wake. Then Marcus removed a plain gold ring from his pocket. "I once owned land," he said. "I lost it because I trusted someone who shared my name. After that, I decided never to build anything I could not abandon quickly." He looked toward Doyle Feed, then back at her. "I do not want your store. I do not want to stand in front of it or behind it. I want to stand beside you in whatever happens to it." Marcus lowered to one knee. "I cannot promise I will never feel the road calling when life becomes difficult. I can promise I will recognize the feeling for what it is." "What is it?" "Fear." He held up the ring. "Rebecca Doyle, will you give me a reason to practice staying for the rest of my life?" Her eyes filled. "You already have one." "Is that a yes?" She pulled him to his feet and kissed him. "Yes." They married in February. Rebecca wore dark blue because she preferred it. Marcus continued working at Barrow Ranch and helped with deliveries on Sundays. He never called Doyle feed his. When customers asked for the owner, he pointed toward Rebecca even when she was standing beside him. Within 5 years, the store supplied 4 counties. Rebecca added a second warehouse and hired 2 widows whom other merchants considered unsuitable for heavy work. She paid them the same rate she paid men for the same job. Marriage did not make Rebecca less independent. It simply gave her one place where she no longer had to defend it. They had a daughter named Anne. At 14, Anne came home angry after a boy called her too large. Rebecca took her to the pasture where Silver grazed, older now but still proud. "Do you see that mare?" Rebecca asked. Anne nodded. "Some men once thought a smaller horse would be easier for me." "Were they right?" Rebecca smiled. "Easier is not the same as right." Silver lived to 26. Everett Pike served his sentence and never returned to Millbrook. The town did not transform all at once. It simply became harder to repeat the old insults while buying feed from Rebecca, accepting contracts from her, or watching Silver carry her down the center of the street. Have you ever been told you were too much? Tell me what they meant and what you did with it. Subscribe to Dusty Mercy for a new Western story every week.